Ms. Patten, in your new book, you describe your experience as governor of Hong Kong as the most interesting and worthwhile 5 years of your life. So looking back 20 years ago, do you recall how you were feeling? You were holding the folded Union flag at that handover ceremony. What was going through your mind then?
So the job of being mayor, as it were, of Hong Kong was terrific. And the job of negotiating with the Chinese, I wouldn't say was terrific because I was dealing with what's called the struggle school of diplomacy. But nevertheless, it was challenging, to use a polite word, and one was always aware of the really big issues for everyone concerned in those negotiations.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in your final speech as governor, you said Britain had provided the scaffolding that enabled the people of Hong Kong to ascend. To what extent do you think is that scaffolding now falling apart?
I don't think it's falling apart, but I think it's threatened by Chinese behaviour. They've certainly pulled away one or two struts. And why has that happened? For the first few years after the handover, while China rode back some of the proposals on freer and fairer elections, by and large they let things stand. But I think what's happened since President Xi Jinping has been in office is that just as he's cracked down on dissidents in China, like the Nobel Peace Prize winner who's unfortunately dying or just out of prison hospital of cancer. Just as he's cracked down on dissidents, he's also increased the tightness of the grip that China has on Hong Kong's windpipe. And that's a worry because Hong Kong is guaranteed its freedoms under an international treaty between Britain and China. And I think also a lot of people will look at how China behaves in Hong Kong as an indication of whether or not you can trust China in the 21st century.
How concerned are you about how divided parts of Hong Kong are, and is there any way actually to heal that rift? Presumably not easily.
I think the divisions are a result of China's behavior, of the behavior of the Communist Party in China. It must be profoundly unsettling for the Chinese authorities to discover that the majority of young people in Hong Kong don't want to think of themselves in any way as dwelling under the same under the same roof as the Chinese Politburo. I mean, they find the Chinese Beijing view of the world very different from their own, and you see all that in opinion polls about people's sense of their own identity. It's one of the things I've written about in my book. So that must be unsettling for the authorities in Beijing, if that is, they take any notice at all.
When those sort of pro-democracy protests started happening, we know and we saw the pictures of people being tear-gassed in the streets at those demonstrations. What was notable by its absence here was any sort of mention from the British government about what was happening in Hong Kong. And I guess some people there do feel betrayed, don't they?
Yes, they do. I mean, during that period, there were one or two slightly nervous clearings of the throat by people in the Foreign Office and elsewhere.
But not more than that.
But not much more than that.
How much then has Britain failed in its responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong? You were there right at the very end. You made that promise that the UK would fulfil its responsibilities.
I think there were some things we could have done better. But by and large, I think we made a pretty good fist of running Hong Kong, and we handed over a going concern. One of my advisors said that he couldn't understand why the Chinese didn't recognise that we'd given them the keys to a Rolls Royce, and all they had to do was to turn on the ignition and off she'd pop. But that's the truth of the matter. We had handed over a city, a territory, which was to a considerable extent made up of refugees from some of the awful events in modern Chinese history. The Great Famine, the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. People who had swum to Hong Kong, people who'd clambered over barbed wire fences in order to get away from the mainland. So it was a city very largely made up of refugees and immigrants from mainland China, and you can't expect them to view with huge enthusiasm being back in China's grasp.